Well, hello and welcome to today's show. If you're watching here on YouTube, then do make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want more from Unbelievable, you can go to the info with today's video to find the podcast and indeed sign up for the newsletter. Today on the show, we're talking about the return of the God hypothesis. Stephen C Meyer and Brian Keating join me. Stephen C Meyer is Senior Fellow of the Discovery Institute and a noted thinker advocating intelligent design. He's been on the show several times in the past. His new book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, examines several key fields of science that he believes have reignited the case for a creator God. Well, in conversation with Steve today is Brian Keating. He's the Chancellor's Distinguished Professor of Physics at the University of California, San Diego, and host of the Into the Impossible podcast, and is himself an author of the book Losing the Nobel Prize. And today we'll be discussing some of these key areas of physics, such as Big Bang cosmology and fine-tuning, that Stephen engages in his own book, and whether they do provide evidence from which we can infer the existence of God. So welcome along to the show, Stephen and Brian. So great to have you both with me today. Let's begin with yourself, Brian, as someone who's new to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your scientific career. I'd love to know what Losing the Nobel Prize is. It's a fascinating title to a book. Tell us all about that then.
Yes, thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's great to see Steve, who's become a newfound friend, and we've gotten to know each other really well. Justin, I followed you for a long time. So Losing the Nobel Prize is a how-to guide on how you too can lose a Nobel Prize should you get close to the opportunity. It's really an exploration of the biggest topics in science, written from the perspective as a memoir of a young experimental cosmologist, and it's meant to kind of be almost an antidote to some of the flowery, some say a little bit too suffused with the woo-woo-ness of borderline paraphysics, metaphysics that some of my theoretically inclined colleagues engage in from time to time. It's meant to be grounded in the excitement, in the majesty of really doing physics at the world's extremes. I tell the story of launching rockets into space, of taking telescopes to the borderlands of South America, to the high desert of the Atacama in Chile, to the South Pole, the very bottom of the planet, and what it's like to do astronomy and connecting it to the through line that goes back to my hero Galileo Galilei. And running through it is a different through line, which is the pursuit of perhaps understanding the biggest picture questions in cosmology and physics, maybe even in philosophy and theology, which uniquely amongst all the sciences is imprinted upon cosmology. You know, I never find that in my colleagues down the hall from me in the condensed matter physics, experiments who are studying superconductors or studying, biophysics, and, for all I know, they're cutting open frogs. I don't know what they do over there. I think the dean should investigate, to be honest. But but they're not really wrestling with these deep questions of, how did it all begin? And I wanted to do that from the perspective of an experimentalist, in contradistinction to my wonderful colleagues. Some of my best friends are theorists, but how do they approach it? And one of the leading guideposts is the person who starts off Steve's wonderful new book, Lawrence Krauss, who is a guest on my podcast, and his theory that really posits the universe came from nothing. For the first time in history, Justin, we can test that assumption using actual telescopes and data. It's a thrilling time to be an experimental cosmologist.
Wow. Well, it's a great podcast you run, Into the Impossible. I do recommend it. Loads of fascinating conversations on the frontier of physics and philosophy and that kind of thing. I'm looking forward to digging into what you make of Stephen's new book as well in the course of today's show. So thank you for joining us, Brian. Steve, welcome back to the show. Tell us a bit about this new book, because in some ways it's the first time you're really tackling God, isn't it? Even though many people may think, well, that's what Stephen's been talking about all along. But tell us about why you decided this book was the book you needed to write right now.
Well, right. You've kindly had me on before to talk about my previous books, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, both of which made a case for intelligent design based upon the discovery of the information-bearing properties of the molecules at the foundation of life, the DNA, the RNA, and the whole complex information storage, transmission, and processing system that we've discovered in even the very simplest living cells. And I argued in the previous books that information in our experience, whether we're talking about the digital code in a computer program or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book, information embedded in a radio signal, is the distinctive hallmark of mind. It's something that we know from our uniform and repeated experience always arises from a mind of some kind, I argued in the previous books, but did not attempt to identify the designing intelligence responsible for that indicator or signature of intelligence at the foundation of life. In the wake of writing such a book, I had a number of people ask, well, who do you think the designing intelligence is? And what do you think that science can tell us about that question? And so I'd been wanting to write a book about that for a long time. I've been chewing on this for about 35 years. And in this new book, I broadened the scope of inquiry to look not only at the evidence of design in biology, but also the evidence of design that we find in physics and what's you've had many guests on discussing the phenomenon known as fine-tuning, the evidence that the basic physical parameters of the universe are against all odds and for no underlying physical theoretical reason, finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life, to allow for a life-conducive universe. And then in addition to that, looking at the evidence from Brian's field in observational astronomy, astrophysics, and cosmology, suggesting that the universe, as best we can tell, had a beginning, and then there's also some theoretical physics that reinforces that conclusion. So I became intrigued with the idea that when we look at that ensemble of evidence, the evidence that we have for the beginning of the universe, the evidence that we have that from the beginning or soon thereafter, the physical parameters have been finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life, and then the evidence that we have that comes on far down the timeline for the presence and origin of information in our biosphere. I've argued that those three classes of evidence together support not just a designing intelligence of some unspecified kind, but rather a designing intelligence who must be both transcendent, in some way transcend the domains of matter, space, time, and energy, but also a designing intelligence who is active in the natural world long after the beginning of the universe itself. So not a deistic creator, not a space alien who could not explain the origin of the universe, but instead a designing intelligence who has the attributes that traditional theists, Jews and Christians and others have long ascribed to God, thus the return of the God hypothesis.
Yes, well, you've summarized what is, a pretty meaty book. In fact, I got the advanced copy here, and it's a meaty fellow, as you can see, but
that's embarrassingly meaty.
It's not quite as
the published version does not look quite so. The published version doesn't look quite so foreboding.
Justin, you should know I got the same copy in my office in early December, but it came with a note. It said, Professor Keating would very kindly request you providing an endorsement for my new book, and I would really appreciate it if it could be obtained by next week. And and I learned something from the late, great countryman of yours, Freeman Dyson, who was a good friend of mine. When I asked him to endorse my book, Losing the Nobel Prize, he politely declined, saying, I never endorse a book that I haven't read, and I've got a stack, yay high, and so I'd have to decline. And I've always followed Freeman's dictum, and I explained that to Steve, and I said, at this rate, it'll take me a couple months, and he said, that's okay. And I read the whole book, and I loved it, and I did indeed provide a blurb for Stephen's wonderful book.
There you go. You did. You provided an endorsement. Now, I was going to say, how has that gone down with your colleagues? Because let's accept it, Stephen and the Discovery Institute are not necessarily flavor of the month for everyone. Putting it mildly.
Do we have? Are you saying we have critics, Justin?
That's what
are
I'm
we radioactive? Yeah, toxic. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, this, and I was, I listened to the podcast you did with Steve yourself, Brian, and you talk about this very, very openly at the beginning of that there are plenty of friends of yours and colleagues who would, regard askance this idea of talking to someone who does support an intelligent design and so on. So have you come in for any heat for doing even this kind of a show with Steve? What's been the reaction?
Yeah, well, I used to have tenure. Unfortunately, I have some news. I'm going to be seeking a position at the Discovery Institute.
You've not only lost the Nobel Prize, you've now lost tenure as well.
That's right. What's next? What do you have to lose? Once you have now I have true freedom, as Joni.
Freedom's just another word for ... right?
Yeah. No, I haven't. I mean, there are internet trolls who will say things. I should say that my audience, as I'm sure for both of you guys run phenomenal channels, they're incredibly erudite. They're not afraid of challenging assumptions. And what is a scientist if he or she cannot accept criticism? And those of us who say science is fixed, science is not provisional, are not really acting in accordance with the scientific method. That's not to say that just because some authority says it, or just because Stephen is so brilliant, obtained his PhD from Cambridge, we should listen to everything he says, or because he's a New York Times bestselling author. No, not at all. And so my blurb is very carefully constructed and not at all edited. And Stephen has the highest, utmost integrity. And I wouldn't have done it any other way. And in fact, I said, and Steve and I had many conversations, as you know, my path to, practicing faith, we can discuss some other time, but I started off as a biologically born Jewish person. I am still a biologically born Jewish person. But along the way, I was an altar boy. I was an atheist. I was an agnostic. I was a practicing quantum Presbyterian. No, I wasn't that. But but I've had a relatively ecumenical upbringing. But I said one of my challenges that I have with eminent theologians and even erudite, physically erudite theologians like William Lane Craig is that the supposition can be made from cosmological arguments to the acquisition of a faith directly in the salvation via Jesus Christ. And I cannot, as a practicing Jew, accept that. And I told Stephen that in all candor. And we had lovely long debates, and we will continue to have those debates. And I cherish those. And that is a sign of an open scientific mind. So to the extent that my colleagues would criticize it, I would ignore them, to be honest with you. And thankfully they haven't. And I think they've encouraged me to have more conversations, even with other folks who are supportive of design critiques. I would say, though, and I don't think Stephen supports this, young Earth creationism, that's a different matter.
Sure. Well, obviously, and I do appreciate you coming on in spirit of openness to talk about this. I was going to ask Brian sort of if you would work to kind of put yourself on the faith spectrum where that is, and obviously you're a practicing Jew, and in that sense you're open to the basic hypothesis, I suppose, of God anyway, in that sense. But I suppose what we'll come to later.
And Justin, one of the things that we clarify.
Yes.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Yeah. Well, I was just going to say one of the things that we clarified in our initial conversations between the two of us was just that the argument I'm making here is not a specific Christian apologetic. This is an argument for basic theism, and the considerations that would be relevant to evaluating the different theistic traditions, I think, come from other sorts of sources. You would have to evaluate what theologians call special revelation as well as general revelation, and then be differences in philosophical approaches to theology that would be part of that discussion as well. But I think the case for basic theism, my view, is that it's very strong, and it has there are both philosophical and scientific reasons to adopt a theistic position that are strong, and those are things that are held in common by Jews and Christians and non-religious theists as well. So, of whom there are quite a number, actually. It's interesting, and some of the other endorsements I received from the book from very prominent scientists, it kind of surprised me that I think there's a greater openness to a theistic interpretation of modern science as opposed to the kind of really strident scientific materialism and scientific atheism that we inherited out of the late 19th century.
We'll get to some of the specifics in a moment. I noticed Lawrence Krauss hasn't endorsed the book, but you do nonetheless open the book with a story about Lawrence Krauss. Just tell that one quickly and sort of how it relates to what the book is about.
Oh, sure. I had a debate with Professor Krauss at the third, in fact, that I'd done, and it was at the University of Toronto in the spring of 2016. And I was unfortunate enough to get a migraine about halfway through my opening presentation, and it made it difficult to pull words for for much of the rest of the debate. But near the end of the debate, it was under the heading of the topic at hand that night was what's behind it all, and the the moderator asked, well, summing up, what do you think is behind it all? And I said, well, I really had come here hoping to talk more about the identity of the designing intelligence. We didn't really get into that, but I explained that I'd been a theist for a long time, and I thought there were three key pieces of evidence that supported a theistic view from modern science, and they're the ones that I reprised for you just a few minutes ago, that the universe has a beginning, as best we can tell, that it's been fine-tuned from or soon after the beginning, and there have been big bursts of digital information into our biosphere since the beginning. And I got a lot of mail afterwards, emails from people who felt sorry for me for having gotten a migraine. Good news on that front is that I finally took the advice of my neurologist and started taking magnesium every day, and I haven't had a migraine but one in 5 years, so it's been a fantastic change. So that was a silver lining. Another silver lining for me was that I got these emails from people who said, well, of all the things that were said in the debate, the one thing that stuck with me was the thing you said at the very end about the three key evidences. And the one final silver lining for me, which actually led to my reading the book, was that reading Professor Krauss's book, Universe from Nothing, led me to get into the technical papers that were the basis of his proposal. This is a research program called quantum cosmology. And the research Dr. Krauss was popularizing the work of a quantum cosmologist or a physicist named Alexander Vilenkin, who had developed a model of the origin of the universe that was a slight variation off of something that Stephen Hawking and James Hartle had developed, also under the heading of quantum cosmology. And as I got into that subject, I realized that as much as this was being presented as something in support of scientific materialism, the basic worldview that Krauss espoused, he's a scientific new atheist. In fact, I thought, and I defend in the new book, the idea that the quantum cosmological approach actually has latent theistic implications. That is to say, the nothing from which everything comes is actually a mathematical actually mathematical in character. It's conceptual and mathematical. It's the laws of physics before there's any physics. So that's pure math. And what's called the universal wave function that they use to explain the origin of the universe is a consequence of a prior equation called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, which is an analog to the famous Schrödinger equation in ordinary quantum mechanics. And to solve that equation, the quantum cosmologists acknowledge that they have to constrain degrees of mathematical freedom. They have to establish boundary constraints on the solution, on the equation, to make it soluble. And that's another way of thinking about inputting information into the mathematical modeling. So to get a universe like ours, they have to get a particular universal wave function. That universal wave function is the product of an intentional choice of the modelers to solve a particular equation in a particular way, which is another way of thinking. What they're really doing is they're inputting information into the mathematical apparatus by which they model the origin of the universe. But where's that information coming from? Where are those constraints on mathematical possibilities coming from? From the minds of the theoretical physicists. So even if they could explain how you get a universe out of pure math, which is quite a trick, they can't explain where the information came from that allows them to explain the universe in the first place without tacit reference to intelligent design. So that got me thinking there's a new way to formulate this cosmological argument, not the way that, say, William Craig does with making the argument solely dependent on establishing a beginning, but rather by showing that whichever way you go, there are theistic implications.
That's really interesting. Brian, this is obviously your wheelhouse, as it were. So tell us what did you make then of what Steve had to say about cosmology, particularly Big Bang cosmology, and some of the ways that people like Krauss have tried to solve that in a way that doesn't require, if you like, a big banger, a cause. And again, you'll have to try and, for the sake of me more than anyone else, keep this fairly lay level. Analogies and whatnot are always good.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry for bumping in the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, but we'll try to break it down later.
I'll keep it to 16 dimensions, Justin. I'll keep it. So what I've noticed lately with my colleagues is that they kind of cleave on one of two axes. They either reject completely the notion and find the notion of God so anathema they won't even treat it. They'll treat it as a 3-letter word. It's almost as if the a 4-letter word is almost too too much encomia to provide to such a concept. So they'll treat God with so much disdain. On the other hand, there are those that will embrace it, such as Michio Kaku, who I've had on my show, and about which Stephen and I have much to say. Or in his new book, The God Equation, which ends with the very same words that Stephen Hawking's epochal book, A Brief History of Time, ends with, which is, once we obtain the final theory of everything, not guaranteed to exist, by the way, but once we do, presumably in string theory, his pet theory, then we shall know the mind of God. We hear from your countryman, the late great Paul Dirac, we heard that God is a mathematician of a very high order. We hear of the God particle, the God equation, the mind of God. I hear about it so much. These are God-saturated people. And even your very own Fred Hoyle, who I am 1 degree separated from, courtesy of the office that I have at the University of California, San Diego, once held by Jeffrey Burbidge, who is Fred Hoyle's great colleague, and Jayant Narlikar, who is Fred Hoyle's student, who I've interviewed on my podcast. These are steady state theorists who used to claim that cosmologists only adopted the Big Bang, Justin, if you can believe it, because they were overwhelmed by Genesis 1:1. So I came to become puzzled. Which is it? Are we atheists or are we theists? And if you read this literature, you come to the notion that we are deeply, deeply schizophrenic, or in other words, we can't make up our minds. And I think that belies sort of the incipient paradigm shift, that we can't really explain this fundamental chicken or egg problem of which came first, a universe or nothing. Which came first, atoms, matter, or a mind? Which came first, the information or the blueprint itself? And I think that's why Stephen's book is so vital. If it isn't correct, as I say, it makes you, it forces you. It's inescapable. Like Einstein's equations themselves, they encode within it the way to do the mathematics that lead to the equations of curved spacetime. Stephen's blueprint lays out a blueprint. You may not agree with it, but you have to confront the airtight logic, and you can replace it. Actually, I've confronted it because it is so so engaging, and it's hard to think that a book 579 pages is a page turner, but it is. And in so doing, you must grapple with this fundamental question: which came first, the universe or the information? And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and the conversation continues, because there are those that say, perhaps no, Stephen, and he knows this, the information is not all that finely tuned. And perhaps that is a valid objection, but these are open questions. And again, my job as an experimental cosmologist, it's been said that there are mysteries in life and there are puzzles in life. A puzzle is something like a Rubik's Cube. I might not be able to solve it. You might not be able to solve it, but Steve can solve it, because he's super smart, right? So somebody can solve a puzzle, but a mystery, that might not be able to be solved. My job as an experimentalist is to turn as many mysteries in the universe as there are into puzzles. Into
puzzles, that's good.
That's what I want to do, and I want to do it with data, and I want to do it while I'm alive to do so. And so to have these blueprints, to have these burning questions, it's a fascinating time to be an experimental cosmologist because we can actually do it with data. And so that's what I'm looking for. Are there signatures, not in the cell, but in the cosmos, that we can look for, not to prove our theories, but to disprove alternative hypotheses? That's what makes my job so exciting.
I mean, do you feel, Steve, that the Hawkings and the Krausses and others who arguably have been more wedded to a sort of naturalistic approach to things, kind of they have their own sort of outcome which they're headed for, whatever the physics or the maths tells them, that they're always going to be looking for a conclusion that, in a sense, excludes God? I mean, is that arguable?
Well, I really am uncomfortable assigning motives to people with alternative points of view, because I think you have to settle, to the extent the issues are settleable, you have to settle by appeals to evidence and to reason. But there is a phenomenon in especially in theoretical physics and some of the subjects that can't help but come up against these big questions, a phenomenon that is sometimes called the God-obsessed atheist, the strident atheist who also can't stop thinking about these big questions and raising godlike types of concepts. Just pick up on one of the things that Brian said about this idea that, well, there's some people that say maybe the fine tuning isn't that finely tuned, maybe the information is not fundamental. One of the things that really inspired me to write the book was the realization, as I've studied both the biological evidence and the physical cosmological evidence, is that there's something kind of incorrigible about the role of information in the universe, or the role of fine-tuning. There are these now multiverse hypotheses that have been proposed to explain the fine-tuning, and I think it's the go-to atheistic explanation right now. There are physical reasons to consider the possibility of a multiverse, but I think the popularity of the multiverse is directly a consequence of its role in atheistic apologetics. And I think that's, in a way, speaks to your question. But what's interesting to me about the multiverse hypothesis is that for the multiverse hypothesis to work, you can't just say, well, there are all these other universes out there that are causally disconnected to our own. You have to show that the universes, otherwise, the things that happen in those other universes would have no effect on what's happening in our universe, including whatever process it was that set the fine-tuning parameters. So in virtue of that problem, multiverse advocates have proposed various universe-generating mechanisms. And what's interesting about those universe-generating mechanisms is that even in theory, those mechanisms require prior unexplained fine-tuning to render plausible the idea that they could generate new universes. So even the multiverse doesn't really get rid of the fine-tuning problem in the same way that the quantum cosmological proposal doesn't get rid of a deeper kind of fine-tuning or information, the information that's needed to produce a mathematical outcome that can function as an explanation for a universe like ours. So there's something incorrigible about the need for specificity and information, and every attempt to explain it requires either a mind or prior unexplained specificity and information, fine-tuning. And I think that's something. I had a line in the book talking about Einstein and when he confronted the redshift evidence, and I said that the universe talked back to Einstein because initially he didn't like that idea. But I think the universe is talking back to us when we attempt to push the information problem, push the fine-tuning problem out of view. It has a way of popping up elsewhere. It's an incorrigible aspect of reality, and it's one that in our uniform and repeated experience only minds explain. And therefore, I think that's a very powerful indicator of or a supporting idea, an idea in support of theism.
Okay, we're going to go to a quick break, and we will be back in just a moment's time. We're talking about the return of the God hypothesis and some of the key aspects of science that Stephen C. Meyer believes have reignited the case for a creator God. He's in conversation today with Brian Keating, who's Professor of Physics at the University of California, San Diego, and host of the Into the Impossible podcast. We'll be back in just a moment. For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter. We're talking about the return of the God hypothesis on Unbelievable today. Stephen C. Meyer and Brian Keating join me. Make sure to check out the links with today's show to find out more about them. It's a fascinating sort of whole area. I love talking about this stuff. Often I can't always keep up because have you had any pushback, by the way, Steve, on the fact that you're not a physicist by background, but you're obviously tackling these big subjects in a book like this and critiquing, some pretty significant physicists out there? I mean, do people say, who are you to write this kind of a book, Steve?
Well, actually, my first degree was in physics, but I did philosophy of science, and philosophers of science have this bad habit of butting their nose into all the questions that are left unanswered by all the other disciplines, or the really interesting questions, is the way I would put it, that are at the intersection between science and philosophy. And it doesn't take long to get a handle on the basic physics. The question is, what do you make of it? And that's where, I hope to make a contribution. So. Yeah. And actually, on the question of pushback, no, not really. I mean, I've had some wonderful endorsements from the likes of Professor Keating, who's with us today, your countryman, Brian Josephson, who's a Nobel laureate in physics from the University of Cambridge. And so I think, as I said, I think the minds are opening. And I think the idea that there's an open and shut case for scientific atheism is kind of past its pull date, and I think people are beginning to open their minds to the possibility of intelligent design, and maybe even on a cosmological level.
Stephen has a unique distinction of having a Brian who won the Nobel Prize as an endorser and a Brian who wrote Losing the Nobel Prize as an endorser. It's a very
We should have gotten it for
rarefied.
his honesty, if nothing else. That's my opinion. But anyway.
Well, look, I wondered if in this section of the show we could dig in a little bit to the Big Bang cosmology side, the fine-tuning side. We did a show recently actually on fine-tuning with Luke Barnes and Sabina Hossenfelder, which threw up some interesting questions, which you both might want to comment on as well. But just repeat again sort of the different approaches that there have been to solving the question of how the universe came into being, Steve. And again, just to elucidate again why you think they both actually potentially have these theistic implications. And then I'd love to hear Brian talk about that.
Well, there's a fascinating story that Brian knows well and that I tell in the book of just the progression of observational astronomy and astrophysics, cosmology in the 20th century, from first the assumption that the universe was eternal and self-existent to initial indications that the universe was expanding and expanding outward in a way that suggested if you wound the clock back, you would get to a point where you couldn't go any further, where there must have been a beginning. And then competing models that were proposed to try to explain the basic observation of an expanding universe. The steady state model proposed by Hoyle and Bondi and Gold, and then oscillating universe models in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And so I tell the story of the conclusion by the end of the century, but most astrophysicists and astronomers had accepted either the standard Big Bang model or what's now called inflationary cosmology, which also presupposes a beginning. And there were in the 1980s a number of books written by leading astrophysicists, for example, Robert Jastrow in his book God and the Astronomers, that were pointing out that if there really was a beginning to the material universe of matter, space, time, and energy, then that posed a grave difficulty for materialistic explanations for the origin of the universe. Because if it's matter that comes into existence, if matter and energy come into existence, then prior to that, there's no matter and energy there to do the causing. And when Stephen Hawking, along with Roger Penrose and George Ellis in the late 60s and early 70s, proved these singularity theorems on the basis of general relativity, that also gave additional weight to the idea that there was a beginning, but Hawking was very troubled by that. And both from a scientific standpoint, he would have preferred to have had a materialistic or physical explanation for the origin of the universe. And I think from a metaphysical standpoint, he was uncomfortable with the theistic implications. And so he devised, in 1983, the first what are called quantum cosmological models, and then published a very popular book about them titled A Brief History of Time in 1988. And I was fortunate to be a grad student in Cambridge at the time. I was actually able to attend some of the lectures that he gave that became the basis of that popular book. So I've been interested in this for a long time. And the quantum cosmological model is an attempt to explain the origin of the universe as a consequence of a quantum idea of gravity, not Einsteinian general relativity, but the idea that there might have been a different type of gravity operating in the very earliest moments of the universe after the Big Bang inside what's called Planck time. And the idea there is that just as in ordinary quantum physics, and okay, buckle up here just for a second, people listening, because I got to explain this, but it's hard to explain, so let me give it my best. But in ordinary quantum mechanics, just as the particle can be lots of different places before an observation is made, and we have a way of describing that mathematically with what's called a wave function, the quantum cosmologist said, well, we could apply that mathematics to the early universe and describe all the different possible universes that might emerge out of that cosmological singularity, where each different universe would have a different gravitational field and a different configuration of matter and a different spatial set of dimensions. And so the idea was that if that universal wave function describing all the possible universes that could exist also included a universe like ours, then we would have explained the origin of the universe as a consequence of this underlying quantum theory of gravity. The rub came in two ways, and this is why I think that even this new approach trying to circumvent the problem of the beginning has theistic implications. The rub was twofold. First, how does math, pure math, generate matter? And this was first acknowledged by Alexander Vilenkin. He said it in the very last page of his book, Many Worlds in One. He says, before there was matter, space, time, and energy, what could these fundamental laws of physics, what tablet could they have been written on? In our experience, math is conceptual. It comes from a mind. And he then said, are we then really saying that there was a mind that predates the universe? problem one. In philosophy of physics, this is called the reification of math, treating math as if it has the causal powers to produce actual matter, space, time, and energy. In our experience, math doesn't have that power. It's something we use to describe matter, space, time, and energy. It doesn't produce any of those entities. The second problem was that in order to get that universal wave function that might include a universe like ours, a prior big hairy equation, a functional differential equation called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, has to be solved. But there's an infinite number of possible solutions to that equation unless the physicists themselves fix very specific boundary constraints on the equation. Now, in ordinary physics, an equation like that would get information about the boundary constraints from the physical system being described. If it was, for example, a string fixed between two walls, a string oscillator or something, the boundary constraints would be determined by the physical system you're going to describe. But before there's matter, space, time, and energy, before there's a universe, there's no physical system to give you information about how to fix those boundaries. So where do they come from? Well, it turns out that the physicists, the theoretical physicists, the quantum cosmologists chose those boundary constraints in order to get an outcome that they wanted, which was a universal wave function, which would include a universe like ours. In other words, it was a teleological, end-directed mathematical modeling where there was an input of information into the mathematical apparatus in order to achieve an outcome. Now, that's nothing more than, that's just modeling the need for a mind to generate a universe like ours. It's a form of intelligent design. I think it lends plausibility to the idea that there needed to be a pre-existing mind. So even the quantum cosmological approach I argue, has theistic implications, which is odd
Brian.
because it was proposed by very ardent scientific atheists, including Lawrence Krauss.
Interesting. Right. Brian, thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, so I have to push back with respect on Steve in that these theories of inflation were never posited to either provide a non-theistic or materialistic origin of the universe. They were posited, in effect, to explain certain features of the universe that were thought to be necessary, perhaps demanded to be conditioned for the existence of life, but not necessary to obviate or to eliminate the need of a creator the way that the quasi-steady state universe was. Although there were sort of philosophical categorical classes that they do share in common, whereas the anthropic principle and retorts to them, they were percolating around the same milieu in the 70s and 80s when particle cosmology came about. For example, I don't think anyone would say that the absence of magnetic monopoles, that would really be, a kind of a tick in the box for God. God could really hang his hat on the absence of magnetic monopoles. And that was one of the prime motivations for Alan Guth, a young postdoc struggling to find a job. We can all relate to that in the late 1970s, dealing with inflation of a different kind back then, and obtaining this great position at MIT where he remains to this day. And yet, it turned out that this solution that he found would later have to be solved by another colleague at Stanford University by the name of Andre Linde, operating under a completely different set of constraints in the former Soviet Union to understand the properties of phase transitions. And it was found that in order to explain the properties that were wrong, that were known to be wrong with the initial inflationary universe. And this is something, Justin, I don't know if most of the lay people in the audience might appreciate. Typically what we in cosmology and most scientists do is we don't solve a problem. We just correct a whole host of problems that existed in a previous problem. And I always tell my graduate students when they come to me and they say, Brian, I solved this great problem. I say, Mazel tov, you just earned your ticket to an even harder problem because you just picked the lowest fruit, and now you got the next one up because that's what we do. Newton was right. And he found the law of universal gravitation, and he paved the way for Einstein. Well, Einstein isn't the final word, and we now know about the properties of atoms. Well, Bohr was right. He won a Nobel Prize for this model of the atom that we know to be completely wrong, but it had certain properties that were correct. Those were updated and corrected by Schrödinger, Heisenberg, and the Born and the quantum revolution. So, too, with inflation. Now, the difference with inflation is that it might not be possible, even in principle, to prove it wrong, let alone to be proving it right, because of the fact that concomitant with inflation because of the apparatus that's been built on to correct its lacuna, is this notion of the multiverse. It's almost impossible to find a model of inflation that predicts the beautiful patterns in the microwave background. So now we can play God, and I can bring in a universe, and we can look at the universe here as a deity would, and we can see these finely tuned structures, these fluctuations that would later become clusters.
For the benefit of those who are listening on the podcast or radio, you're holding a sort of 3D image of the background microwave radiation here. So just explain, what?
Yes, it's a beach
very
ball.
colorful and beautiful, right?
Yeah. Yes, it's a beach ball made by my friends at NASA, rendering the image of the tiny fluctuations in the cosmic microwave background that are far smaller than the fluctuations in this real beach ball compared to its size. These are at the part in 10 to the 4th. Fluctuations. They're smaller than the height of Mount Everest compared to the height of the Earth. These are incredibly tiny fluctuations. So just think from space, you see pictures of the Earth. You can't see the height of Mount Everest compared to the smooth globular structure of the Earth. Anyway, those structures are consequences of inflation. But what inflation leaves out is how did it itself get started? And that's where the multiverse comes in. And Stephen's exactly right. What Hawking and others tried to do is graft onto a theory of cosmic structure, a cosmological kinematic theory. They tried to graft on a theory of cosmogenesis, of cosmogony. And that is something it was never designed to do. And I feel that this is causing us a great deal of challenge in cosmology, not only because of theistic overtones, but because it's simply overextending what it's designed to do. And so it will never be able to provide a adequate answer to how did it itself get sparked? How did the spark that ignited the Big Bang, as I call inflation, how did that itself get ignited? That is a question that inflation itself can't answer. And the more that the Krausses and the the Glindays try to explain it, I think it'll prove to be almost impossible to wriggle out of.
Justin, I'm real sympathetic to what Brian has just said. One point of clarification is that my critique of the Hawking, Krauss, Vilenkin approach is not that it's necessarily wrong, but that even if it's right, it has theistic implications. And I'm not claiming that inflation was generated as an anti-theistic argument. I think it was a very good theory to try to explain the flatness problem, the homogeneity issue. Inflation. But one of the interesting things about inflation, which Bohr, Guth, and Vilenkin showed with their famous theorem, is that even if inflation is right, there's still a beginning, and you don't get around the beginning problem. And I think that's what Brian is just saying, that and with the beginning, there's the question of ultimate causation, which I don't think is solved within any materialistic framework. And quantum cosmology was super interesting to me because it presented itself as a framework by which you might be able to explain ultimate origins materialistically, but instead what it did was it explained it mathematically. And prior to that, in the mathematical apparatus, there was even the need for an intelligent input in the modeling. And so, if true, then clearly I think this is, at best, I think you get a sort of Platonic idealism out of quantum cosmology, because you need conceptual realities to produce the matter. You need math to produce the matter. But if you have to also manipulate the math to get the outcome you want, then what you're really modeling is the need for intelligent design.
Now, I wonder, Steve, if we should talk a little bit about alternatives to inflation, which have certain virtues that inflation does not.
Yeah, that's your bailiwick, so you should go for it.
Yeah,
if our host agrees, we shouldn't take over his interview.
I'm all for the alternatives. Let's hear some alternatives then to inflation, Brian.
I would never presume to do that on another man's podcast. That is most
podcaster,
rude.
Yeah.
So there are alternatives. Interestingly enough, they're both promoted by two of the original contributors to both the singularity issue of the Big Bang cosmology, along with Hawking, was Roger Penrose, a winner of the 2020 Nobel Prize, a good friend of mine and a frequent guest on my podcast, as well as Paul Steinhardt, who made some of the initial corrections to Alan Guth's original theory. and the inventor of many things, such as the theory of quasicrystals and many other. Both of these gentlemen, I claim, kind of are denying paternity to some of their earlier theories that they've once fathered and sired back in their youth. In the case of Steinhardt, he is now one of the most vocal, full-throated critics of inflation, calling it, in his words, not only dangerous to science, but dangerous to society, because it invalidates and eviscerates the centuries-old scientific method by basically providing, eviscerating the scientific method and saying we no longer need to subject our theories to scientific proof. And there's an article, I just interviewed Alan Lightman at MIT about his new book, Probable Impossibilities. And at the end of that book, he interviews Andre Linde and favorably compares him to Archimedes and many other explorers of ancient times in terms of grappling with infinities. And the notion is that the infinite universes that populate the multiverse from the mind of Andre Linde sprang are kind of tantamount to the grappling with infinity that Zeno and others have wrestled with since the time of Anaximander and the beginning of philosophy.
And Brian, is Steinhardt's objection there that they're inherently untestable? And also, and I don't know if he goes this far, but this is something I argue in the book, is that if you permit these infinite universe cosmologies, you also have this situation where anything can happen for any reason at all in some possible universe, and it ends up resulting in science destroying consequences because you can't rely on the uniformity of nature, you can't make predictions, you can't make explanations, and you end up with Boltzmann brains. So I don't know if Steinhardt agrees with that, but that's one of the problems with those cosmologies.
Exactly, Steve. It destroys the testability. It destroys the meaning of the probabilistic measure that you can assign. It's not even clear what probability means in a multiverse. What are the odds of an event happening? How do you define an ensemble? What is the notion of philosophy? Here's an issue, maybe, Justin, for another time to discuss with Stephen. But what would, if you have an infinite number of universes, and not only are the laws of nature have to be finely tuned and the parameters, the speed of light, the strength of gravity, but why not the laws of logic? Why not the laws of mathematics? Could they vary from universe to universe? Could modus tollens? Could modus ponens? Could all these laws vary from universe to universe? But that's not Paul's objection, a priori. His objection is simply that you can't make any predictions in a multiverse, and anything you get could be consistent with some other particular set of laws or set of laws of physics or laws of law. So that's his objection. Sir Roger Penrose has called the fine-tuning issue and the very low entropy state configuration that Stephen talks about in The Return of the God Hypothesis. He calls that fantasy. And he calls that, and again, he's one of the originators of the singular theorems with Stephen Hawking, the late, great Stephen Hawking. So these men, not only, though, the reason I want to point them out is they don't only assail with slings and arrows from the sidelines. They have constructed theories, rival theories, to the inflationary universe that not only solve the problems of cosmic structure formation depicted on this very comely beach ball that I'm holding up here, very colorful, but they also provide a crisp test to falsify themselves. In other words, they have a mechanism by which they can be proven wrong. Whereas we just established that the inflationary theory can not only not be proven right, it may not be able to be proven wrong, because not observing the inflationary signatures is not necessarily refutation of the multiverse or of the inflationary theory itself. So both Steinhardt and the Penrose theory have testable consequences, and they both happen to be related to the theory of cosmic microwave background polarization that is my team's specialty.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, Steve, some commentary on those alternative theories, and whether or not they have an anything to say to the God hypothesis itself.
Yeah, I certainly don't think they refute it. In Penrose's model, in fact, both of these models involve, they're cyclical models where you get multiple universes generating over time. And back in the 1980s, when the oscillating universe, which was a kind of precursor to these ways of thinking, was popular, Alan Guth showed that, with whatever is causing the expansion of the universe, the process of expansion is generating disorder and entropy. If you think of blowing a lot of energy through a system, you're going to get a lot of disorder. So if you want to get another cycle out of that, you've got to find some way of resetting the entropy to a lower level, just making things more orderly again so that you have more energy available to do work. And in both of these new models, this is still a problem. In the Penrose model, you have the universe expanding for a long time, and out of a very old universe, you get a new universe arising. And he posits a field which he calls the phantom field, that he alleges is capable of making that crossover from our sort of the dying embers of our universe to a new one. But it has almost godlike properties. And another one of his colleagues at Oxford, Julian Barber, has commented on this and said this type of field has no analog in any known physics, because it operates only in a particular time and in a particular space, and it has the ability to reset entropy, and it has the ability to initiate a dramatic change of state. In other words, it sounds more like a mind than a physical field. And so it's a really interesting proposal, and I'm really always open to evaluating and looking at new such proposals. And it may end up being testable, as Brian says, but the mechanism that he proposes at this point is more than speculative, and it has these properties that are contrary to our uniform and repeated experience of physics itself. We don't know of physical processes that can spontaneously, at just the right time and just the right place, reduce entropy, increase order, and generate whole new changes of state. And the Steinhardt model also has this same difficulties. He has the new universes arising more at the beginning of after a big crunch, and he also requires an entropy setting resetting mechanism. And he acknowledges that it would involve novel interactions between the different physical fields. So that it's at this point, there's not a lot of specificity there, so I'm not sure it's yet testable, but it's at least an attempt to solve the problem.
Whether it's the kind of inflationary model or a kind of, mathematical model or one of these other models, for you, none of them seem to be able to escape the need for some sort of information and, to make it work.
And the Penrose, interestingly, the Penrose model has exactly the same character as these quantum cosmological models, in the sense that his phantom field is a purely mathematical entity that suddenly transforms into a physical entity without explanation. So you go from math to matter, and I think that's inconsistent with what we know physics does. Math is a conceptual reality. So it's interesting to me that the kind of mechanism that he ends up inventing to make that crossover has godlike properties. And it can reduce entropy. It's immaterial initially. It operates only at a particular time and in a particular place, and it can generate a change of state at that time and place, as a mind could do by making a choice. So to me, it's kind of interesting. I mean, it's certainly worth exploring, but it seems to me to kind of reinforce the need for a God hypothesis because of the causal profile he's painting of the entity that he posits, which would be necessary to explain a new universe arising, has attributes that are more like agency than like matter.
Quick response, Brian, and then we'll go to a break, and we'll try and fit in something on fine tuning as well. But yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Steve. The only slight kind of tweak to it is I would say that they might not be philosophically or mathematically fully fleshed out, but they're currently falsifiable. In other words, we can currently or imminently, with tools like my colleagues and I are building on the high Atacama Desert at 17,000 feet above sea level, the Simons Observatory, funded by the Simons Foundation. If we observe the so-called twisting, curling pattern of microwave polarization that I describe in Losing the Nobel Prize as B-mode polarization, that will be the death knell for Paul Steinhardt's model. And he candidly admits that. That would invalidate and eviscerate his model. So although the underpinnings of it are not fully fleshed out, of course, you have to look at the sociology of science. It's a sociological field. Even if some argue that sociology is not a science, but there's still a sociology within science, and there's a tremendous amount of energy that goes into fields like string theory and inflation, and very little that goes into alternatives. So it's remarkable how much he has extracted from this incipient, theory of him and very few others like Neil Turok and Anna Aegis, but almost very few others have really picked up that mantle. And yet we can perhaps prove it wrong within a few years with tools and technology that my colleagues are building currently and will be deploying.
That's fascinating. So, and bully for the experimentalists in this, that actually can hold feet to the fire with some of these theories and say, do they work or not? Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. We're going to go to a quick break, folks, talking about The Return of the God Hypothesis, new book by Stephen C. Meyer, in conversation today with physicist Brian Keating. We'll be back in just a moment.
In the United Kingdom, just today, we passed 100,000 people who've been killed by the virus. I'm not the one here who is claiming that this is being supervised, that somebody is watching this, somebody knows that this is occurring, and somebody's allowing it to occur.
We're in no position to say definitively there is no morally justifiable reason for this particular evil, because we need a godlike perspective on all of space and all of time in order to make that claim.
Been such an interesting discussion today. The Return of the God Hypothesis. It covers a lot of ground scientifically, but we've specifically been focusing on Big Bang cosmology. And in this final section, I wanted to cover really the fine tuning. My guests today are Stephen C. Meyer, the author of the book, and Brian Keating, who's the author of Losing the Nobel Prize. Go and check that out, but also his Into the Impossible podcast. I'll make sure there are links to both of them, but just for the record, it's briankeating.com if you want to find out more about Brian, and stephencmeyer.org for more on Steve. Again, we're going to have to keep this as simple as we can, folks, but I did want to touch on fine-tuning. Now, let me give a really basic sort of definition maybe of what this is, the fine-tuning of the cosmos for life. It's the idea that from its birth, the universe has been sort of comes at us with a set of specific numbers, certain law, physical constants, and certain specifications in the way that it's set up that appear to be perfectly attuned to allow life to develop, for chemistry to happen, for there to at least be the possibility of life in the universe. And on the face of it, there's no apparent reason why they should have taken these particular values, and the tiniest change in them would mean that life is not possible in the cosmos. And so this has generated a whole lot of interesting literature around why this might be, and whether there are natural explanations for it, multiverse theories, where this has come up a lot again in this regard. Maybe you could just sort of start from there, Steve, but maybe let me toss an immediate objection at you, which came up very recently in a show that I did with Sabine Hossenfelder, who's a physicist in Germany. And Sabina's whole problem with the idea of the fine-tuning of the cosmos is that she says it's unquantifiable, because we can't know whether or how much these numbers and constants for these physical quantities and so on could have differed from their actual value. So it's impossible to place a probability on them and therefore talk about them being likely or unlikely and so on. I'm probably not doing justice fully to Sabina's point, and you can go and watch the show for more on that. But what's your general response to that kind of an objection to the fine-tuning?
Yeah. I know Sabine's objection. In fact, I've written a little piece about it at our Evolution News site. But maybe to put her objection in context, and I could explain it a bit more as well. Let me just explain a little bit more about the concept of fine-tuning. As you explained very well, many physicists have discovered that there are many basic parameters of physics: the strength of, for example, gravitational force, the strength of electromagnetic force, the strength of the strong and weak nuclear forces, the masses of the elementary particles, the quarks, the up quark and the down quark, the cosmological constant, the outward pushing force that's responsible for the expansion of the universe, and many others, must fall within very fine tolerances or limits in order for life to exist in the universe, against as it happens, all odds as best we can tell, because there is no underlying physical theory or principle of logic as to why these basic parameters have to have the values that they do, or the forces have to have the strengths that they do. In addition, I should also mention that the initial configuration of mass and energy at the beginning of the universe is exquisitely finely tuned to allow for the possibility of things like stable galaxies. And you don't even get basic chemistry without this fine tuning. So Sabine's objection is, well, yes, that seems to be right, but the range of possible values in which you could have a gravitational force is very wide, but we don't know that there isn't some underlying reason why gravitational force has exactly the value there that it does. There might be some and she posits a multiverse, as many physicists do, as an explanation for the fine-tuning. And as I mentioned, multiverses require universe-generating mechanisms. So she says, well, maybe the universe-generating mechanism is biased in such a way so that the gravitational force has to land within that narrow bandwidth. And so therefore, what it seems improbable against all the possible strengths that gravity might have, it's not actually improbable because there's something biasing the production of universes with that exact strength of gravitation, or any of the other parameters might be similarly biased. But when you think, and so that's the objection. It can't be quantified because whereas there's a lot of possibilities, we don't know that every possibility is equally probable. One might be more probable than another because of this underlying biasing in the universe generating mechanism. But my argument in response to that is that if there is such a biasing in the universe generating mechanism, then there must be fine-tuning in the mechanism itself that is directing the outcome towards that propitious endpoint. You can't get specificity without prior specificity. You can't get fine-tuning without prior fine-tuning. And you actually find this in all the models of in all the universe generating mechanisms that have been proposed. They all require prior fine-tuning, and I explicate that in some detail in the book to make the point that even if the multiverse is true, is correct, you haven't circumvented the fine-tuning problem. You've just pushed it out of view to one step back, and it still remains unexplained from a materialistic standpoint. Whereas what we mean by fine-tuning, which is an ensemble of improbable parameters that exemplify a set of functional requirements, is, in our experience, always the product of mind, whether we're talking about French recipes or internal combustion engines or universes.
It's interesting you say that of Sabina, because on the show I had with her, she was very dismissive of multiverse theory, and it's one maybe to take up with her again. Maybe we could get you on with her in some, but she's not here to talk us through that, so we'll hand it over to Brian at this point.
Well, whether it's with a multiverse or some other mechanism, you can't get biasing towards an outcome without some prior setup of conditions. It's got to be directed some way towards that outcome, and then you would have the fine-tuning in that set of whatever the universe generating mechanism is. And I read her to be implying a multiverse, but she does certainly refer to a universe generating mechanism. So that's got to be biased. Yeah. It's got to be fine-tuned.
Yeah. It may not be a multiverse she has in mind, but yes. Well, let's leave that for another time. But I mean, this is a well-worn area of the sort of intersection actually of science and faith in many ways, Brian, because the fine-tuning does, on the face of it, look to be crying out for an explanation. Is it, in your view, valid to potentially posit God as the best hypothesis as an explanation?
Well, I did a video for a channel called Prager University about 3 years ago, and it was entitled, "What's a Bigger Leap of Faith, God or the Multiverse?" And it was funny. I got millions of views, and I have an update to that on my YouTube channel as well that your viewers can find, Dr. Brian Keating. And in it, I say, for centuries, people really would believe without proof very many things that you can't actually verify. And I kind of make the analogy towards, if you think about, all the criteria that go into making a choice of where you want to go for dinner, or, for me, it was, when I got married, my wife had a very, specific set of criteria in who she wanted to marry. I don't know how I passed this sieve. For me, it was like, will she say yes? Can she tolerate me, for more than a few minutes? But overlaying all these different criteria, and typically the way we see things presented in cosmology is, like there's a two-dimensional plane and there's certain parameters, the mass of the proton, the strength of gravity, this beach ball that the NASA team made that depicts the fluctuations in the cosmic microwave background that I'm holding up if you can't see it, if you're listening to it on the radio or audio only. These fluctuations can be big, but they can't be too big. They can be small. They can't be too small or we wouldn't be here. Would there be too many fluctuations? There'd be overmassive black holes, et cetera, et cetera. So now the combination of all these things put together, layered on top of each other, is very interesting. That sieve becomes very, very finely grained indeed. And to me, the question of, the joint probability of all these things occurring at once is simply a very, very, it may be a question outside of science. And when I ask that question, or the title of the video, what's a greater leap of faith, God or the multiverse? The scientists who reply, scientists don't have faith. And then I reply, with quotes from Andre Linde. And it really, I'll just put the quote there. And it says, why should there be universe? And he says, in his own words, why not multiverse? You say universe, meaning one, that's more faith than saying multiverse. And famously with Martin Rees and Steven Weinberg, he was asked, on the scale of betting your life or your dog, what would you bet? Martin Rees said, I would bet my dog. Andre Linde said, I'd bet my life. And, of course, Steven Weinberg said, I'd bet Martin Rees's dog and Andre Linde's life. And so, you don't bet your life.
And this is about the multiverse hypothesis?
Yes, if the multiverse is true enough. So, of course, we have faith. And, of course, faith enters into it. And to say that scientists are dispassionate walking Wikipedias, that we never have faith that enters into it. So in that sense, they're tantamount. They have very analogous behavior. Scientists certainly do have faith that enters into it. And it's been so since the time of Galileo and even long before that. Prejudice, confirmation bias, all sorts of things enter into it. And there might be this reaction formation that, Freud says, that is just so distasteful. And it's funny because the producers at Prager University, they don't know who Sabina is, but they have an extensive series of references on and a quiz on every one of their videos. And in that video, they chose one of her website posts that said, of course the multiverse is religion. and again, I didn't suggest it to them. They just found it. And I think, she's intellectually honest enough to say that. I think the question is, there are researchers now. Fred Adams at University of Michigan has a 230-page archive post, and he's sponsored by the Templeton Foundation. So it's not some like rabid atheist. What is the degree of fine-tuning necessary to have a universe like ours? It doesn't answer Steve's question. It answers within a universe that is existent, which is, a big if. It's like once you have the universe, there's a famous joke, right? There's a scientist like Jennifer Doudna or somebody, says to God, I can make a man just like you. I can make a human being just like you. Oh, yeah? I can make him out of dirt just like you did. Oh, yeah? Yeah, she says to the creator. Yeah, just here, give me some dirt. And God says, no, get your own dirt. So it's like it's the starting point. It's, as physicists say, the initial conditions problem is a serious condition, a serious vexing problem. And I think that is one of the greatest services Stephen does in this new book, Return of the God Hypothesis.
I mean, Stephen, come back to this then, because this is ultimately, the question at the heart of it all is, can you infer a God from all of the data, if you like? Is that a valid thing? Now, I hear a lot of scientists who say it's no longer a scientific question at that point. You've moved into theology, you've moved maybe into philosophy, certainly into metaphysics, and they will just say that's you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to make that leap to this particular kind of explanation. It's a science stopper is very often the phrase that's used.
Well, I think saying you're not allowed is an inquiry stopper, right? And I'm not really worried about those boundaries. I'm perfectly happy to admit that the God hypothesis is a metaphysical hypothesis, but it may be the best explanation of certain things we've discovered scientifically. There's a wonderful quote from Richard Dawkins, with whom I completely disagree on metaphysics, but I agree in this respect in the way he frames the issue, and he's brilliant at it. He says that the universe has exactly the properties we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Well, blind, pitiless indifference and no design or purpose is another way of saying materialism. And so he's arguing effectively that we can test the metaphysical hypothesis of materialism and other metaphysical hypotheses by looking at the world around us to see if what we observe matches what we would expect if a given metaphysical hypothesis is true. He thinks that what he sees is consistent with materialism, or is what you would expect on the basis of materialism. The burden of proof I take on in the book is not to prove God absolutely, but rather to show that the evidence that we have about the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, and the origin of life, and the origin and the presence of information in living cells are all things that we would not have expected on the basis of straightforward materialism. And you can see that, I think, very clearly in the writings of the scientific materialists themselves, who are now adopting these highly complex, somewhat convoluted explanations that might involve multiverses or imaginary time or space alien designers or phantom fields. I think there's a certain sense in which the atheists are now stretching in order to explain things that can be very much more simply explained by the simple proposition of a transcendent intelligence. And so the idea, when I love this framing of one God or many universes. I've actually attended a conference under that heading, and one of the arguments I make in the book about the multiverse is that in addition to multiverses require universe-generating mechanisms that require prior unexplained fine-tuning. But another problem is the incredible complexity of the multiverse hypothesis in the sense of Occam's razor, because there are two different types of fine-tuning: initial condition fine-tuning, and also the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics. And it turns out that to explain both types, you need two speculative cosmological models involving two different universe-generating mechanisms, one based on string theory, one based on inflationary cosmology. So not only does a multiverse advocate have to affirm the existence of all these innumerable undetectable universes, they also have to affirm all these pure theoretical postulates that are part of the theoretical substructure of these two different cosmologies. You have to believe in inflaton fields, you have to believe in finely tuned inflaton shutoff energies, you have to believe in all the extra dimensions of space that string theory implies, you have to believe in all you have to believe that strings are the fundamental units of matter, you have to believe in lines of flux that are wrapped around them, and on it goes. In the book, I list over, I think it's 10 separate pure theoretical postulates that are inherently unobservable. Nothing wrong with unobservables in science. We postulate them all the time to explain things we can see. But the number of postulates that must be affirmed with a multiverse proposition or proposal are innumerably greater than the single proposition of a transcendent intelligence, which is what comes with theism.
Brian, final thoughts as we start to close this out.
Well, I want to thank Steve very much for making me think and making me exercise the most precious supercomputer there is, which is the 3-pound wet work that sits on top of my shoulders. And Justin, I love your conversations. I think they're so fascinating. I could really talk to you guys all day and for a long time. And I always say, be careful when a cosmologist says, just a few minutes, because, we're comfortable with billions of years. And I really could talk to you guys for an eternity. It's so much fun. These are the ultimate issues in life. And I always say to my students that we're privileged to do these kinds of things and to get paid to do them. We do them for free. Don't tell my boss, Gavin Newsom, here in California. He might take you up on it. But what we get to do, we shouldn't take lightly, because it's the most important thing. We are kind of carrying the flame, and we will always answer, and we will always ask these. That's what makes human beings unique. As Stephen knows, Justin, I'm sure, Homo sapien means a thinking person, a thinking one who knows that they know. But, science itself, the word science means knowledge. It doesn't mean wisdom. How can we convert more mysteries into puzzles? How can we convert more knowledge into wisdom? These are the things I think about. I want to thank you guys. I got to run.
It's great. It's great to have you on today. Thank you, Brian. Yeah. Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
Thank you for being such a good interlocutor, pressing on key issues where we might disagree, and thinking all this through. And Justin, thank you for your format, and you really let us both explicate some of these ideas in detail, and it's just a terrific format for discussing the big questions. So thank you.
Thank you, guys.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Steve, for joining me. Do make sure to check out Steve's book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, and links to both my guests, Brian Keating and Steve, with today's show. But for now, thank you very much, Brian and Steve, for joining me.
Thank you, guys.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.